I'm going to do a short presentation on men, bereavement and substance misuse. I've been working in the substance misuse field for about 15 years in various roles and various capacities, and I've recently just gone back to doing what I really enjoy, which is community engagement outreach work. Previously I've managed a few projects, one around legal highs and a nighttime economy, so I'm back doing what I really like. So, big boys don't cry. Research seems to show that this, and I'm sure that I'm not telling anybody anything that we don't know in here, has a serious impact on our emotional health. There we go. And can often be a burden and lead to physical or mental disorders. Other specific stressful life events also have the potential to increase the risk of substance misuse, and that's something that, as a substance misuse practitioner, we see every day. The impact that traumatic events on our lives have in terms of people looking for coping mechanisms, and specifically men looking for coping mechanisms, and we often turn to alcohol and or drugs. So among bereaved men, the risk of drug and alcohol related problems tend to be higher than women, and again that's a reflection of what we see in our day-to-day work as well. We see more men engaging with us for support around their drug and alcohol use than women. That may be because of the barriers that women often face in terms of accessing treatment. So I wouldn't necessarily just put that down to say that men are less able to cope with traumatic events in life, though there seems to be a lot of evidence to suggest that that is the case. I was having a brief conversation with Leslie before I've come up, and when I was asked to do this presentation, we looked within our system to see if we record some of the reasons why people come and see us, why they use drugs and alcohol problematically, and unfortunately we don't. So I sent an email out to 400 of my colleagues just in Birmingham, just to see if they would have any anecdotal evidence of some of the reasons why people are using drugs and alcohol problematically and coming to access treatment for us, particularly men. And the response was really overwhelming, actually. And in normal cases, we struggle to get responses from my colleagues because they're so busy. But it was really overwhelming, and the examples, I was receiving example after example after example of people that they're working with, particularly men who, at the heart of their substance misuse, there's a bereavement. And what was really interesting is that bereavement is a bereavement it's a historic bereavement. It's something that's happened in the past. It's very. We're not seeing people whose bereavement is fairly recent. We're engaging with people whose bereavement had happened 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. That there is this thing that we as men, we feel as though we need to be strong, and I think society sort of forces that on us. If you look at some of the major blockbuster movies, if you look at some of if you read your tabloid newspapers, we are conditioned to believe that we have to be strong in the face of a tragic loss. And that we're self-contained, that we deal with our emotions ourselves, that we don't need to go to a counsellor, that we don't need to talk to anybody, and that if we, our feelings, we keep them within ourselves. And again, masculinity is often equated to striving, to moving forward, to activity. And many grieving men do use drugs or alcohol as a coping tool, and particularly alcohol, because alcohol is the acceptable drug in society. And we often use it as a way to, in an attempt to distract ourselves from the painful feelings, and often suppressing that natural process of grieving. I use the word "we" deliberately because I'd like to give you a little bit about myself, my journey. As I say, I've been working in the field for close on 20 years in the substance misuse field, so I had the assumption that, I know about bereavement, I know about the process, I know about the feelings, I know how important it is to discuss those feelings. But 10 years ago I lost my son, I didn't grieve. I threw myself into work. I went back to work 4 days after I lost him, which, ridiculous. And I threw myself into work. I found it very difficult to talk to my partner. I and I still didn't seek support. And it wasn't until last year, 9 years down the road, that I felt that I had to. It was no longer a matter of wanting to go and seek support. It was essential for my, and this may sound dramatic, but it's how I felt at the time and still feel now. It was essential for my survival to address the matter of bereavement. And I engaged with a therapist, a talk therapist, and I was in therapy for 18 months. And it probably was the best, the most important, the most life-changing piece of work, piece of training, self-growth, development that I've done in the 50-odd years that I've been on this earth. I work with many clients, and they will give, when we look at it, we look at why do you think you're using drugs or alcohol in the way that you're using drugs or alcohol, and they'll give me every reason other than the real reason, and you have to dig through, and you keep working with those individuals, and you roll with that resistance. And again, I'm sure this is something that you guys do as practitioners of talk therapy as well. You roll with that resistance, and and again, the anecdotal evidence that I've got back from my colleagues supports my experience of working in the substance misuse field, that there is a very, very high percentage of men that are using drugs and alcohol problematically, and somewhere along the line it's connected to bereavement, it's connected to loss. And that loss doesn't necessarily have to be the physical loss of someone. It could be relationships breakdown, for example. We know, again, with men, women seem to cope with the emotional turmoil of a relationship breakdown far more easily than men do. And I suppose I've said to Leslie earlier, I'm really heartened that we've been invited as a substance misuse service to come along to Cruse, because I think there needs to be much more joined at work, without a doubt. We can do, as drug workers and alcohol practitioners, there's so much that we can do, but then it comes to that space where I think it needs specialist support from people like yourselves, who can offer men that specialist support. Our male clients get to a certain stage within their recovery journey, and part of that is understanding and recognising how important it is that we express our feelings, how important it is that we don't keep these feelings within us, because they will manifest themselves in some way at some stage. And again, from my experience, my grief manifested itself destructively 3 years after the loss, and as a result my relationship didn't survive that. And I don't think my situation was quite so unusual that it took me 9 years before I accessed talk therapy. It's not so unusual. I think some of the examples that I gave there, 16 years. Some people have been using drugs and alcohol problematically 10 years, 5 years. And I think if we can, as our two services work closer together, if we can reduce that time that men have to experience the pain and the suffering of bereavement, I think that can only be a good thing.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I've got it all planned today, how I was going to start and what I was going to say. And then this lunchtime, I went into, as part of my work, I went into a school with a colleague where we're looking at a peer mentor programme with secondary school children to support other children who are bereaved. And they put the call out there amongst the school for people to volunteer for this, for young people to volunteer for this. And they had 7 volunteers, all boys. Thought that'd get a reaction. So the future is bright, as they say. Hopefully. Yes, my personal story is in August 2007. My daughter Melissa was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and she died in the early hours of May the 11th, 2008, about 9 months. I always say that my my grief journey started actually on April the 1st, because that was the day that we were told her illness was incurable. That was the point when I started grieving. I didn't realise it at the time because, you know, as was alluded to before, being the strong person, being the dad, it was important that I was supporting other people. And I actually found myself not just supporting my immediate family with my wife and my other daughter, but also extended family, you know, my mum and dad, my wife's parents as well. What's the hardest thing you've ever done? For me, the two hardest things that I would pick out. The first was after my daughter had been told that her illness was incurable and her being sort of high and all over the place on the medication, was her turning round to me and saying, "What did he say, Dad?" And then having to explain to her that her illness was incurable and that she was going to die. The second hardest thing I had to do, and I often think I've heard other people talk about this, and I often think it's underrated, was she died in the early hours of the morning. She died about 1:30 in the morning. About 8:30, I started ringing people. And first of all, I rang my mother and father. I rang my wife's mother and father, brother, sisters. And then I got a list from Melissa of 9 friends who she wanted me to call. And even though they knew she was dying and they knew she was going to die any day, actually ringing up those young people to tell them that their friend had died was so hard, because then you have to be the big strong daddy for other people, you know, for other people's daughters, for other people's sons. And that was real. I still say to this day that is the hardest thing I ever done. And I made the last phone call and I sat on the edge of the bed and I absolutely sobbed my heart out. And it was the first time since diagnosis that I'd really, really cried. I had, again, this feeling during the illness that I couldn't cry. If I was crying, the illness was beating me. And I didn't want that. I needed to be strong. I needed to be there. I went to see the Jersey Boys earlier this year. It's really good. Walk like a man. It's what we're told as men. So often we're told, you know, you've got to walk like a man. You've got to be the strong one. I don't drink, by the way. So the previous, I'm so glad I don't drink as well, seeing the previous presentation. And it's quite interesting because I didn't turn to drink or anything like that. But I always remembered when I was younger, my dad, this is, when I was 18 and able to drink, telling me, "Oh, if you don't drink, you're not a proper man." And then I remember my uncle saying, "If you don't drink, you're not a proper man." So the secret to my grief, obviously, is don't be a proper man. There are times when I feel absolutely drained. And normally I know when I'm having a bad day because I don't walk the dogs in the morning. But I don't say I don't walk the dogs, I just make an excuse. I say, "Oh, they're tired. They don't need a walk today. Look at them lying there. They won't want to go to walk." And then I go and get my shoes ready to go to work and they come up to me like this. So energy issues are really big. I did hit rock bottom. I did hit the point where if I'd have drunk, I'd have been drunk. If I'd have used drugs, I'd have been out of it. But I managed, with the help of bereavement counselling from St Giles Hospice, where Mel had hospice at home, and from a very good GP and district nurse, and the help of Julie as well, because that was the time when our marriage really came to almost breaking point. But we got through it, and now I always say I'm sort of only ever 2 steps from depression. And the first, well, grief, I don't like to call it depression, but grief. And the first step is when I recognise it and I can do something about it. And I do now. I step away from things. We work with a football club now, a charitable trust of football club in Birmingham, and they deal with a lot of antisocial behaviour and things like that. And the number of times there's a bereavement at the bottom of them, it's untrue. It's untrue. And we're working together in partnership. And if you'd have said a hospice and a football club, you know, how do they work together in partnership? But it works. It really does work. I apologise for the next one, but it's a saying of my daughter's that she used to say to Melissa when Melissa's friends were playing her up. Particularly governments and things like that. I recently changed from BT Sport to Sky Sports, and BT Sport didn't try and save me. because I think they could tell from the tone of my voice that I'd had so many issues. I'm not tolerating it. He's not going to change his mind. It's no good if we pay him. He's not going to stay with us. I don't need the hassle in my life. I have enough hassle coping with my grief and dealing with the things I deal with. I don't need that, the hassle of people who cause me issues, things like that. I don't accommodate twins. When I was thinking about this one, I thought I'm far more laid back than I used to be, which is interesting because my mum used to say I was so laid back I was horizontal. But is it that I just don't care? I get a bit of a thrill when I'm going down a hill on my bike at 40 miles an hour. Yeah, I think that afterwards. I think, oh God, afterwards. Why did I do that? But actually, in the moment, there's this thing of not caring. And there's also this thing, I think of it as a bereaved father, that what's the worst that can happen? I was speaking at a conference a couple of months ago now, and there was a professor there. And this professor, before she started, she was shaking and she's like this. And I was just sat there, and she said, "How are you so calm?" And I said, "Well, what's the worst that can happen? You could forget what you say." I said, "Yeah, but in the context of what's happened before with my daughter, that's nothing." And then she said, "Oh, you could trip and fall up the stage." I said, "Well, it happened to Madonna and it didn't do her any harm." So I'm not sure whether it's whether it's laid backness or not caring. I'm not afraid of dying. I used to be, but I'm not anymore. But I am afraid of others dying, of those around me. My daughter lives in London. God knows how I'll be if ever there's a terrorist attack or anything down in London. I'll be an absolute gibbering wreck, because part of your mind says, no, you couldn't lose both children, but reality tells you, you can. Rebecca, on her 21st birthday, was taken into hospital with suspected appendicitis. She was put in the same bay in A&E department. The same doctor was there as dealt with Melissa. And again, it was this, it was by this birthday. And the way that made me feel was more scared than I'd probably ever been. Probably more scared than when Mel was ill, because when Mel was ill, you just sort of dealt with it as it rolled along. You lived in the moment. Whereas this was like, oh my God, not again, we can't do this again. So I am. My wife's very afraid of me dying, because a lot of people in her life have drifted out now. And she's, we were only talking about it the other week. She said, God, if anything happened to you, she said, I'd I'd become a hermit. I wouldn't go anywhere. She doesn't drive, so that's why you won't go anywhere, not because you become a hermit. But she is. We have this fear of something happening to Becky and something happening to each other. And finally, my 5 top tips. I mean, this is based on my experience, and I'm very, very aware that all grief is different. We're all individuals. There will be people out there who have lost children who deal with things totally differently to the way I do, and I fully respect that. But from the things I'd learned, I would say talk and listen to those closest to you. I think the reason our marriage came so close to breaking down was because we didn't talk and we didn't listen. And the listening bit was probably more important, actually. So talk and listen. Don't be embarrassed by your grief. Don't shy away from it. There are times, I have to say, when people say to me, they'll say to me in conversation, how many children have you got? And I say 2. But once I said 1. And the reason I said 1 was because, we go back to the emotional energy thing, I didn't have the energy to go through the story. And it was easier to say 1. And I felt horrible afterwards, and I've never done it since. I felt guilty, and still do when I think about it. But it is this thing of having to tell this. Sometimes you just don't have the energy to tell the story. But don't be embarrassed by your grief, and don't put a time limit on it. My complete breakdown, my suicidal time, was about 13 months after Mel died. It wasn't in the first 3 months. It wasn't in the first 6 months. It was 13 months. So don't put a time on your grief. Don't be afraid to cry. I could cry at anything. I mean, I was terrible before Melissa died. I could cry at the sound of music. That bit where they're on the boat and they come up the boardwalk and he starts singing "The Hills Are Alive" has me in bits every time. So I'm an emotional wreck for something like that. So, you know, I'm not afraid to cry, but I know some men, they don't like to cry, they don't want to cry. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a great release. Great release. Scream as well. Get on a bike, go down a hill and scream as you're going down. It's a great feeling. Great feeling. And discover your M factor. This could be called a lot of things. I call it my M factor because I call it my me factor. And I think it's something that that Mark alluded to well as well. It's what makes you tick, what makes you escape, if you like, what distracts you. My M factor is my cycling. I've discovered that, you know, getting on a bike and getting out into the country and cycling miles and miles, it takes me away from everything. It's my me factor. It's what I do. It's what takes me away. Walking the dogs as well, you know, walking in the countryside and stuff like that. But I have to say, really, my M factor is my cycling. It's my drink, if you like. It's my drugs. And it's a lot more healthy. Unless you fall off, of course. And then it's not so healthy. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Yeta Goodman. I'm actually the Children's Service Coordinator at Cruse in Birmingham, but I do quite a lot of other stuff as well. Mostly anything that's related to IT or anything vaguely analytical, because I have a background working as a software engineer for 10 years before I switched to counselling, which is not actually as different as you might think, but that's a story for another day. I'm not really sure how I'm going to be able to follow those two presentations with such personal stories, such a lot of emotion in them, following it with something about research and evidence, which sounds pretty dry on paper, but I hope it won't be. I hope it will be quite interesting for you. So, I don't know if we've touched on it already today, but we know incontrovertibly that there are far more many women that come to Cruse than men. Round about 70% women, round about 30% men. So that's over twice as many women as men. That's something that's been pretty consistent over the years. It does fluctuate a little bit, but not a great deal. And as we've talked about a lot today, we have our suspicions about why that might be. I could go into a whole other digression about what's so striking about this image. But I think we probably all suspect that the idea of men reaching out for support, of men getting themselves into a onesie for a little bit of affection and cuddling, and men cuddling a teddy, it's just not very manly. It's just not something that we expect men to do. It's not something that men expect men to do. I think it's not something that women expect men to do either. So that was our suspicion. What we wanted to do was actually kind of find something to bear that out, to get together some evidence to find out what's really going on. I don't know if we've touched on it already today, but we know incontrovertibly that there are far more many women that come to Cruse than men. Round about 70% women, round about 30% men. So that's over twice as many women as men. That's something that's been pretty consistent over the years. It does fluctuate a little bit, but not a great deal. And as we've talked about a lot today, we have our suspicions about why that might be. I could go into a whole other digression about what's so striking about this image. But I think we probably all suspect that the idea of men reaching out for support, of men getting themselves into a onesie for a little bit of affection and cuddling, and men cuddling a teddy, it's just not very manly. It's just not something that we expect men to do. It's not something that men expect men to do. I think it's not something that women expect men to do either. So that was our suspicion. What we wanted to do was actually kind of find something to bear that out, to get together some evidence to find out what's really going on. And evidence is something that possibly we sometimes think of as quite a manly thing to do. So there we have a man being all manly and doing his spreadsheet stuff, but this has actually been done by me. So what we did three different things. The first thing was a focus group to look at the family support group. This is a monthly group that we have which meets for bereaved families. I've been involved with it in various capacities for about 10 years, I think. And in all that time, I have never known a bereaved dad come to the family kind of on his own with his children. There have been a few dads who've approached us but never got as far as coming to the group. There have been some dads who come along with their partner if maybe it's a grandparent who's died. So we held a focus group just to look at what might be getting in the way, what might be stopping men coming to the group. We also carried out an online survey on what kind of barriers there might be to support. That's the Survey Monkey. And we did some analysis of our own data. We've got quite a lot of quite sophisticated data, really. Again, IT backgrounds. We've got a system that's been running for quite a few years, collecting quite a bit of data. So I was able to go in and do some analysis of it. And there are a few things that came out of it. One of the biggest things that came out was that the very nature of the group itself is a barrier. Something called a support group, the idea of people sitting around in a circle talking about feelings, is a big turn off for men. It's not something that they're naturally going to want to access generally. And I'm very aware that when I'm talking about this isn't something that men want to do or whatever, that's a big generalisation, and obviously there's a whole spectrum, and there are plenty of women who wouldn't want to come along to a group like that as well. So I'm not generalising about every man on the planet, but generally a support group is something that's going to appeal to women more than it does to men. Then there was the online survey. It was a very short survey, available online through Survey Monkey, but we did make it available offline as well to people who didn't have internet access. Just 4 questions, so just about what would encourage or prevent men seeking support after bereavement. So not to do with the family support group, just generally getting any kind of support after a bereavement. We didn't specify whether it could be men or women filling it in, but in the end it was 93% men who filled it in, and we had over 100 responses, so that's statistically significant. So the data that came out, we think, is quite reliable. So looking at the 4 questions, the first one was quite simply, why don't men ask for support? And the top answer, people were given suggested answers to tick, and they were allowed to come up with their own answers as well. But the main one was, as we've heard from today, they believe it's important to be able to cope without asking for help. It's the big, strong daddy, I don't need that help, or I want to be perceived as not needing that help. Second question was, what are the barriers to support? So assuming that somebody did want to ask for support, what might get in the way of actually accessing that support? And the 2 things that came out were work commitments, which goes back to the focus group and that slightly different emphasis between work and children, and not wanting family and friends to find out. So again, wanting to have that kind of facade, if you like to call it, of being a big, strong man who doesn't need any help. What would help men to ask for support? The biggest answer here was being aware of other men who have had support. And what would help to attend the support session? So you've asked for support, you've got it arranged, what's going to help you stay in and get that support? Convenient times, so times that fit around work, which kind of goes back to that idea about work being really important. The next thing is the data analysis. So as I've said, we have around about 70% of referrals coming from women and around about 30% from men, and that's fairly consistent. Sometimes it goes up a little bit, sometimes down a little bit, but it stays round about there for as long as we've been collecting data, which is a good 5 years now. So what I wanted to do was dig into that data a little bit more deeply and find out what's going on. So for men, is it the case that they have fewer sessions than women? Do they DNA, so do they not turn up to sessions more frequently than women? Do they have different types of bereavement that bring them to Cruse in the first place? And for women, do they get in touch more quickly? Do they tend to cancel less? Do they turn up to their sessions more? And what was really striking about the results when I dig deeper was just how similar a lot of the statistics were, actually. So number of sessions for women, on average 3.5, for men 3.2, so a little bit less, but not a huge amount. I am quite an IT geek, but I'm not a statistician, So I can't say whether this is really statistically significant, but it doesn't look like that's a really significant difference. And I hope there aren't any statisticians in the room, because I was just making it up as I went along, really. So I don't want any questions about the methodology. Referrals, if we just break down referrals into how many women, how many men, so overall 72% women, 28% men. And that's pretty much the same for if we break down the people who cancel and the people who DNA. Same kind of figures, around about 70% of the people who cancel will be women, and around about 30% of them will be men. So the figures there balance out just the referrals that we're getting. But men are more likely to wait to get their support. They're more likely to wait over a year to come to Cruse, whereas women are more likely to come in the first 6 months following a bereavement. Again, it's not enormous differences, but there's definitely a difference there that you can see. But one of the most striking differences is how men and women hear of Cruse. So women are around 4 times more likely than men to hear of Cruse through their employer or through a CPN or psychiatrist. Men are 5 times more likely to hear of Cruse through the probation service than women are. And men are 8 times more likely to hear of Cruse through a drugs or alcohol agency, which I think fits with what we've been hearing earlier on today. And that's where things get really striking. So, conclusions. The evidence does seem to suggest that men find it hard to ask for support. They've told us in the survey, that's what they said, they find it hard to do. And the fact that they wait longer to come to Cruse would suggest that, yeah, it's difficult to ask for support. Women seem to be more likely to ask for help. Women are more likely to come to us through a GP, through a CPN, through their employer. It seems to be that women are going out and saying, I'm stuck, I need some help, and they're maybe hearing of Cruse in that way. Whereas men, it would seem, and it's been backed up by the stories that we've heard today, are more likely to turn to ways of dealing with bereavement which are less helpful. So drugs, alcohol, things that mean that they end up having contact with the probation service. But it does seem from the evidence that once they get that support, it works. And we've heard that in the stories that we've heard today from Mark and Ian. We've heard as well from the data that the stories, the way that they use Cruse once they get to us, it doesn't differ from the way that women use it. It seems to work for them. So that's a key message to take away, I think.
But actually, as an organisation, what does Cruse in Birmingham need to do? From Yeda's research, it was identified that there's a real mystery of what bereavement support means, and I think that's a massive barrier for men. So we feel as though we need recruit more champions, men who are prepared to talk about their grief and actually the benefits of accessing bereavement support, and actually how good it felt potentially to talk to somebody about their grief, open that door and let out their emotions, how beneficial that can be. Increased convenience. A lot of men maybe don't know, or people don't know, but we actually open the office 2 evenings a week. The last appointment 7 o'clock till 8 o'clock. Now, funding dependent and volunteer dependent, we'd like to expand that if we can. But also maybe we just need to promote the fact we do open evenings, so if you're working, you can still access support. It's available for you. Promote the fact we do this already. We tick the box. We already provide a confidential service. Maybe we don't promote it enough, and maybe we don't promote it to men enough. If that's a key aspect of the support and reaching out, we deliver already really easily. We need to promote that fact. As Mark said earlier, and what we've been trying to do for a number of years is work in partnership with a lot more external organisations and support men, and maybe support men in different ways, support the frontline workers, potentially train them up, make them more bereavement aware, train more nurses. We want to launch a club. Can I say a men-only club? But that might give the wrong impression. But we want to launch a club for men who come on an evening. We're, again, funding dependent. We're going to provide the evening meal. It could be a takeaway pizza or Chinese or something. But just an area, and it will be facilitated by Cruse volunteers, but facilitate talking about issues of distress, grief, and maybe perhaps identify the resilience men already have.